1919. Our group is the West Cork Flying Column. We were the flying column attached to the 3rd Cork Brigade during what was known as the Irish War of Independence, or the Tan War. Basically because it was the Irish Republican Army fighting against both the British Army, the Black and Tans of the Royal Irish Constabulary. So we're going to basically do, the column is now taking position. Basically what would happen, they would come together for training camp, which generally would last a week. At the end of that, the terminus of that training camp, they would go out and stage an ambush against the British forces. Most of the time, during the early phases of the conflict, these would have been foot patrols. Later, because of the hazard to themselves, they would travel in motorized transport. So now we're taking you to the ambush scene. The column is in position, and we'll take it from there.
Wash the bastard! Sorry, baby.
As you can see, these interactions were very brief and generally very deadly. The column men are now taking the arms of the mixed British Army and Royal Irish Constabulary forces. That was basically their main purpose. Due to the lack of arms held by the Irish Republican Army, that was the main reason for the ambushes, was to gain very well-needed arms and ammunition. Most of the weapons during this period were captured. They started out, the Irish Republican Army started out using double-barreled shotguns, percussion-capped shotguns, which are no good, only at close range. So the whole idea was to capture the very important 303 Enfield from the British. Form up now. Does anyone have any questions on the period we're representing?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Was that a Lewis machine gun?
That was a Lewis gun, sir.
Wow, that was very impressive.
Most of the arms, as I said, held by the column towards the later days of the conflict were captured British weapons. And that sort of turned the tide in favor of the Irish Republican Army. Being a very small force, there were 38,000 combined British troops, Royal Irish Constabulary in Ireland at the time, against roughly 3,000 to 4,000 effective IRA members. So the idea of capturing those weapons was very important to them. The thing was that the Irish Republican Army held the countryside, where the Royal Irish Constabulary held most of the major towns. And it made it very difficult for the British forces to go between their bases, because the countryside was literally in the hands of the rebels. It was their country, they were fighting at places of their choosing at their own time. And now we can see the volunteers, as they were known. They were the Army of the Irish Republic, the rebel parliament that was established after 1918. The idea behind the British was they, of course, thought they were rebels and were trying to suppress that parliament. And it was not only a military struggle. Also along the same lines was the fact that the Republican Parliament had set up mail services, they set up their own courts, and it was basically a dual civil administration as well, along with the military forces of that group. Do we have any questions for any of our men? Any questions? Yes, sir. He said besides guns, what else would they use? In the early days of the struggle, hurley sticks were employed, but they were never used against the enemy. It was more for training purposes because they had no arms. But at this point, the early phase, shotguns were used. But shotguns, I say, are only good at close range. So the idea was to get your hands on a .303 Enfield rifle, so you could have an effective ambush at a distance. Our distance here is greatly compressed compared to what an actual ambush scenario would be.
How about picking one or two of your members and tell us something about
Absolutely.
his family life, what he did by day, by night?
Absolutely, sir. Most of the Republicans, well, we'll go by the uniforms they're wearing. What became synonymous with the period was the trench coat and the bandolier, mostly captured, I say, from the British. Most of the equipment that they wore. The volunteers themselves, you can see the fellows who don't have the trench coats on, wore their civilian clothing with the captured equipment. That was in order to conform to the Geneva Convention, although the British forces, upon capturing an Irish volunteer, would generally not give them the benefit of, they were considered insurgents, they were considered rebels. The fellows we have down on the end, the Crown Forces, we have a man of the Essex Regiment, a regular British, he's a corporal in the British Army. There were 13,000 British soldiers, the majority of the Crown Forces in Ireland at the time. Next to him is an auxiliary cadet. These were former officers of the Great War, World War I, who had been hired to do police duty. The two fellows next to him would be considered temporary constables, later known as black and tans. If you can see, due to the darkness of the Royal Irish Constabulary uniforms and the mixed khaki, generally of the British Army, because there was not enough uniforms to go around when these men were first recruited. Any other questions for us? But the situation basically was, I say, these men of the Third Cork were fighting on their home ground in their home country against what they considered foreign invaders, foreign occupiers of their country. So they, like I said, even with the small numbers they had, were able to give the British Empire a bit of a lashing when they could. But it was on their terms, and I say at their choosing.
The question I had is
What's that?
did they have to hide all the time? Or
Generally speaking, in every house in Ireland at the time, you had on the back of every front door were the names of the inhabitants of that dwelling, their occupations. So, and in every village and town in Ireland, there was an IRIC barracks. Some were smaller in some of the smaller villages, but those men were in the communities and knew who men of military age were. The term at the time was to be on the run, which meant you couldn't go home because you were a known insurgent to the RIC. And what happened due to that, because these men could not go home, they needed something to do with these fellows, so it was easy to form them into these flying columns. But a lot of men for the duration of the period could not go home because they were known to the local RSC barracks. The smaller barracks in the beginning of the struggle were abandoned because they were untenable. These were generally very small garrisons, and they would go to the larger towns. Now, these barracks, we don't think of a normal barracks, just these were fortified structures